Welcome back to my series in which I slowly update Delfino Square. Last time I replaced those old buildings once and for all. Not that they won't still be something I frequently revisit and adjust, but at least we have something better to work with now. Today, I want to finally move on to the next section of the track and start to update these buildings in the narrow alleyway section. I started things off by, first of all, saving the project under a different name. That way I have a backup of last week's version, in case I irreversibly mess something up. Looking around at these narrow street buildings, these are going to be quite a different process to the other buildings. With those, I could just replace them with new geometry, but that wouldn't work too well here, since there are just so many buildings. I've got to figure out a way I can work with the original mesh that runs along either side, but a flat retexture won't be enough. It's going to have 3D detail. But first and foremost, we need to separate the three different types of buildings so they can each have their own base material. Unfortunately, the process of separating these was quite finicky. Usually pressing the L key while in edit mode works pretty well to select separate linked geometry. But here, huge sections of the building are linked, regardless of which section of the building texture they use. This leaves me a couple of options.
And I could just sit here and select them all like this. Except the doors should be separate too. Except I can't do that on this. Am I really gonna do that?
Sitting here and selecting the buildings by hand would work, but I think I'd rather die. So instead I'm gonna try and find a way to somewhat smartly select them from the UV map. This isn't the cleanest UV map ever, but eventually I was able to select most of the white buildings. It took a little bit of selecting correct doorways and deselecting incorrect ones, but I think this is what we're looking for. Now I can separate them by pressing P and move on to the next building. Now we've got the brown buildings separated from the,
What color is that?
other buildings, so now I can get to work on some textures. But before we do all of that, let's go back to those original buildings and see if I can improve them a little bit. I got some really good feedback on these. Some of you took issue with the fact that the bricks were stacked vertically, as traditionally, bricks aren't stacked vertically. Instead, they're stacked properly. So let's get to fixing that. Now the reason they were vertical wasn't because I've never seen a building before, although that's probably not helping. It's because I was trying to avoid using yet another brick texture, since my textures are already quite unorganized. See, I tried using the road texture here, and it was almost perfect. The issue was that there were road markings showing up, so my solution was to rotate it 90 degrees and use a repeating strip that didn't have road markings on it. And that's how you end up with a consistent 90-degree discrepancy on your make-believe masonry. But now that I've made a new brick texture out of a section of the road and messed with the unwrapping enough, I think this is a definite improvement. But what about the yellow buildings? The bricks look pretty subpar here. I got the unwrapping looking a little bit better, but I'll need to do more about these in the future. I think it's about time we get back to those alleyway buildings and see what we can't come up with. Now replacing each and every one of these buildings in this video isn't feasible, but what I can do is come up with the designs, which is the actually exciting part. The first step is to find a base material. This concrete material from Toad Harbor looks like it'll be close enough for the white building. This looks pretty good. Now I've got to design a 3D piece that'll sit on the face of each of these buildings. The first thing I did was make this weird looking top right window. I started with a cube, because that's the closest shape to the window. Also because I only ever start with a cube, no matter what the closest shape is, because that's just how I operate. So running on high octane cube energy, I loop cut and inset faced my way to a window. And maybe one tiny boolean modifier, don't tell nobody.
Okay, gonna do a boolean with this. Which is okay, you're allowed to use boolean. That's why boolean is bad.
I put the sandy concrete material on the window and made a pitch black material to go on the inside faces. But this doesn't quite look right. There's no smooth shadowy transition, it's just an immediate void sitting externally on the building. Now I could use ambient occlusion, but that would mean creating a shadowy version of this concrete material that just sits on the inside of the windowsill. Otherwise, all of these buildings will have ridiculous levels of ambient occlusion. I tried having an emissive glow coming from the window, which looks pretty neat, but I think it's better suited for a nighttime render. Strangely enough, what ended up making this window look better was adding curtains on either side. I used the knife tool with K to cut some simple messy geometry onto the window, and made sure to have the curtains unwrapped so that they utilized the shadowy part at the top. Well, now we can get to work on the other windows. These were more of the same. Now, looking back, this is kinda hard to watch since this face piece ended up being something like 400 polygons, which is kinda concerningly high considering it'll be sitting on each and every one of these white buildings. But luckily, it's too late, so I don't have to worry about it or feel guilty. Now we've got a face piece that we can painstakingly move around to each building and tweak to fit the slight inconsistencies of them. I gave up after 30 minutes only got me this far. It doesn't look like it would take a long time to do this, but it somehow does. So instead of doing all of that right now, let's just design the brown building. The tricky thing here is the level of detail that I'll be trying to achieve on the texture. It's much easier to fancy up a single image of the front of a building, but when I'm trying to use a texture that tiles and is somewhat flexible, I can't necessarily just go drawing pretty designs on the base texture. I'll have to think about where things should go specifically on the image to end up somewhere on the model, because my windows are 3D, they're not on the texture. After I set up a sort of similar texture, I made a 3D version of the ledge at the bottom of the window, and these shutters being swung open is going to help add some life to the front of the building. I used a basic square image window, and this is looking pretty good, but it's a bit bland. It needs some of those fun, vibrant accents that the original texture had, so I found the bricks that sit below and above the windows, brought in some of those bright colors from the original texture, and began painting bricks with color overlays. This definitely adds some fun to the texture, but it's a bit Tetris-y. But what ended up looking really cool was just painting some little dots next to the bricks. I think this is gonna work, but now the white building texture just looks so plain in comparison. It's pretty much just a single tone color palette material. So I got some other materials that had some weathering that I could comp onto the original material in a way that would be consistent on each building face. Now that looks much better, but there's one building left to update, the one that I don't know how to describe it. Gray, pink, copper, I don't know what that is. I started by coloring a brick texture and adding some of that weathering to it, but I accidentally ended up with a medieval castle look. So instead, I just did a color burn gradient at the bottom of the texture. That's more like it. But this texture's gonna be a little boring without something else going on. So I took this weird looking part from the original texture and put it across the top. With the roof on, this looks pretty cool. But it's currently a bit of a dungeon with no means of letting light in, so let's put up some windows. I started with some basic windows from one of the yellow buildings, but if I want to be true to the original version of this building, I should have some little cloth roof things over the windows. So I modeled them out of a cube and used a texture from Toad Harbor. These are really vibrant. So vibrant in fact, I had to throw them into Photoshop and wash them out a bit. Not usually something I have to do. But now, I really like these. I think this is gonna look great when it's all set up. Except something happened over here. I think this was a good first step into the narrow street section of the track. I know I didn't do anything with the shortcut idea, but I will get to that at some point and design it in a way that doesn't make the normal route feel obsolete. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed watching. I'll talk to you later. Thanks.